So we're just thrilled to have Kristine McDivitt Tompkins here with us today. Kris is a fourth-generation Californian, which is very cool. I'm only a first-generation Californian, maybe one day. She's from a ranching family whose life has always revolved around a passion for the outdoors. And when she was a teenager, she worked summers at what would become Patagonia, Inc. And of course, after graduating college in Idaho, she joined the company full-time and eventually, of course, became their longtime CEO. And she worked alongside their founder, Yvon Chouinard. And in 1994, Kris retired and married climber entrepreneur Douglas Tompkins. He was the founder of North Face and the co-founder of Esprit. And working together, Kris and Doug achieved some really incredible results in the creation of national parks. And as you may know, just on January 29th of this year, Kristine and Chilean President Michelle Bachelet joined forces to create 5 new national parks and expanded 3 others, adding a total of 10 million acres of new national parkland in Chile. It's truly, truly remarkable. Yes, here's to that. So, of course, truly an incredible achievement amongst many throughout your great career. So we're really thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you.
Let's dive in.
All right. Well, I thought I would take all of you on a very fast tour of some of our work. I think I have 10, 15 minutes that I can talk to you straight up. I'm going to get out of this chair and move it to the side.
I'm going to leave you up here and I'll come back.
All right. I thought the best way to do this today is give you a little bit of background of Doug and me and why was it that we started out in business and ended up where we did, working in the Southern Cone in conservation and other areas. So I'm going to start off with a little video that places you where we are as of the last 60 days.
It's the biggest deal of its kind in history. This is an unbelievable opportunity for conservation and for Chile.
There we go. So, how did we get going on this path? And I thought I would put this picture up of Doug and me back in the day in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Both of us were climbers, ski racers, and through that life, we obviously developed a great love for the things seen and unseen about the natural world. And really just a world and a commitment of having a wild life. Also, you guys are probably too young, but I'm sure you've seen photographs of the 60s, and we were definitely influenced by the activism that sprang out of that decade and ran into the 70s. And it became one of the clarion calls to our personal lives, and surely some of you have been moved by these things as well. That kind of ethos, that kind of direction really was one of the reasons that the 3 companies that we're associated with developed the kind of ethos that they did. And of course, Doug with the North Face and Esprit, and Yvon Chouinard, whom I worked for a total of 25 years or so. They had different products, but absolutely a long list of things in common. In 1993, Doug had already sold his portion of Esprit, and I was getting very itchy as the CEO of Patagonia. I felt like I wanted to do something else, but I wasn't quite sure what it is. And then Doug Tompkins drifted into my life, and he had put more thought and longer thought into how might we commit ourselves to the things we love in the third stage of our lives. And that ended up forming family foundations and basing ourselves out of Chile and Argentina between the United States, focused on building these big projects. So our foundation is based on 5 areas. Conservation is probably the one that we're most well known for. That's the conservation of landscape and marine systems, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Restoration, the restoration of forests, the restoration of grasslands, the restorations of our minds, but also the restoration of extirpated species wherever we're working. What is missing? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but rewilding, the idea of bringing back species to those areas where they had gone missing, became easily half of our work today. Regenerative agriculture, as Doug always says, if you don't get agriculture right, you can kiss off the rest. Because agriculture is the greatest use of terrestrial earth. It is unconventional ag, toxic to the soils. We could talk about erosion and all sorts of things that are happening today and for the last 100 years in ag, but we are very active there. And finally, activism. As Ed Abbey said, sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. So unlike a lot of conservation groups, we take activism very, very seriously. We believe that if you see something that is going and trending in the wrong direction toward your values, that you need to stand up and shake the tree. So finally, healthy, dignified human communities. We have a saying, economic development as a consequence of conservation. So where we work, we're not finished with our work until local communities, provincial communities, and in some cases, the national political scene can benefit from the very things that we're working on. And that's very long-term work, but very satisfying and a must. So off we went. We based ourselves outside of Pumalín Park. This is in 1993. Big change from running Patagonia and swirling around the world, and that's where we ended up. This is the farm where we were based when we were working on Pumalín, and it's a roadless area, one of 2 only between Fairbanks, Alaska, and the tip of South America, and we were planted in the middle of one of them. Big change. Over the ensuing years, we began to put teams together and build a kind of mental architecture for what could happen in these regions in terms of conservation and working on the other goals that we have. In the ensuing years, this is what we've done. We have 13 national parks and just over 13 million acres that we have put in to permanent conservation in the form of a national park. That's what those teams have been working on. We have a team here in San Francisco. We have one in Chile, of course, and one in Argentina. So why national parks? When we think about conservation, we get asked that question a lot. Why didn't we just buy the land, put a big lock on the gate out in front, and leave it alone? And for us, first of all, we grew up in the national park system of the United States, which is a big part of our culture. You don't think about it so often, but there they are. And if you took them away in the United States, you'd find yourself lacking. You find yourself wanting them back and defending those national parks. They create a kind of image for a country that helps define who we are as a nation. But more importantly, we look at it as a democratic move. If we close off this the millions of acres that we acquired, and nobody comes in. It's like owning a Picasso, and you hang it in your living room, and you and your family can look at it, and maybe some friends, but that's it. If you hang it in at MoMA, millions of people can see that Picasso every year. And that to us is essential, that access, trails, all the things that go in with national parks are available. So I'm going to take you on a very, very speedy tour through 3 of our parks that each have a different ecotype. So starting Pumalín, as you can see, the little white box, it's on the Pacific coast in southern Chile. It's the first park we ever worked on, and it goes from the Andes at the top of the Argentine border through 800,000 acres of forest and down to the Pacific Ocean. We were famously called the couple who cut Chile in half when we first got going. And we were called a lot of other things too, but I won't go into that. So this park is just over 1 million acres and just declared a national park in February 27th of this year. The alerce trees, there are 30% of the last stand of alerce trees in this park, a first cousin to the giant sequoias here in California. A lot of flora and fauna. It's an impenetrable forest, which has probably been a benefit for it because otherwise a lot more of it would have been cut. It's also just an exquisitely beautiful, wild place. And we have our own volcano that went off in 2008 and created tremendous havoc for us in cleaning it up and reforming. Architecture in all of our parks are always connected to place. So you never go to a park that we've worked on and find the same style of architecture. In this case, it's a chilote wooden style reflected in bridges, reflected in everything we do. So, forest, rainforest, and now we move south to Patagonia National Park. And we actually have one of the longtime founder types sitting in the back row back there. This was started in 2004. It goes from the edge of the northern ice cap in southern Aysén and has the Bacher River as its western edge. And it's roughly, well, no, not roughly, 764,000 acres, much of which is grassland. It's considered to be one of the biggest grassland restoration projects in the world, but I never trust those kinds of statements, so I just say it's one of the biggest. It's beautiful, it's emblematic, and it crosses the border. It goes to the border, and what you're looking out from the border in this shot is Patagonia National Park in Argentina. They're not yet contiguous, but that would be a wonderful dream to have them touch one another. Lots of animals there, some you recognize, some you won't. This little guy is coming back from having been almost extincted from the area. So you have all these little kinds of victories. Predators like mountain lions coming back once you stop persecuting them. Bird life, everything begins to come back as you take, in our case, 50,000 head of livestock off this former ranch and take all the fences out, which was nearly 500 miles of fence line, and you see the region begin to heal itself with lots of visitors every year. And this too was just made a national park at the end of January of this year. A lot of wildlife work in this park. Pumas are coming back. You have a deer nearly extinct, and this is a long story, but I will just tell you that I have often found that the easiest thing we've done is actually acquire the land. And the minute the ink is dry on the check, projects like this arise as they rightfully should, and they become the challenges and headaches and you hope a few successes as you go along in creating these big protected areas. These are not guns, they're dart rifles. And just to show you a little bit about how much work there is to do besides creating just the infrastructure and acquiring the land. Another species reintroduction here up on the border. And you can see the architecture for this park reflects a Patagonia. It's actually an English style that was settled by the English who came to Argentina and built the railroads in the 1800s. And of course, any good park has campgrounds, has trails, and so on, and this is no exception. This I put in here because this is an example of activism. There was I won't go into the whole story, but there was a move to dam two of Chile's most pristine and beautiful rivers. It was an 8-year fight, millions of dollars spent, many NGOs working against it, and truly David and Goliath, and we won, and those rivers run free. So activism attached to conservation. Never leave it far behind, in my opinion. The third one, Iberá National Park, 1.7 million acres in the northeast, eastern section of Argentina, so cross the border and go north. This is wetlands and savanna grasslands. It's hot, subtropical. When we first visited there, got out of the plane and said, let's get back in the plane. It's too hot here, there are bugs, and it's flat. And Doug insisted and came back quietly and bought it a month later, the first piece of property we started with, because this is what he saw. I missed it somehow. The tremendous biodiversity, an area that nobody really knew that the province had. It was sort of like no man's land. And we've come a long way since 1997, and it is now a national park. So just some pictures of what is there, but then what is missing? Within 5 years of having arrived there, we began to realize that species who were missing had to be dealt with. You had to actively figure out how to bring them back, which in Latin America was really unheard of in most of the Americas. The jaguars were missing. Giant anteaters were missing. Tapirs were missing. Green-shouldered macaws missing. And so we committed ourselves over the last 14 years to start bringing them back. And all of the species that you just saw have been brought back, with the exception of the jaguar, because we have adult jaguars, but you can't release them, which is another talk altogether. But suffice to say, where there is someone missing, we have committed that where we work, by the time we leave, they will be back. So just a few shots of what this entails, working with the jaguars at the Jaguar Breeding Center, and so on. So as we roll out of those projects, we are an ongoing team working on new projects, one of which is in marine conservation. These are the first two marine national parks of Argentina, something we started just over a year ago. So lots to talk about, but I'm going to leave it there because I think it's more engaging if we get a very fast overview and then start to visit. A lot of people ask us, why do we do this? We just buy yachts and go lay on the beach. Well, this is one of the reasons. And this little guy, certainly top choice. And generations of humans in the future. We can't imagine that it's ethical to leave for future generations a mess, which is the course we're on. And as Jane Goodall says, we are stealing from our children's futures. And so how do we work against that trend? That's really the question mark upon us. So thank you. I'll grab my chair back.
All right. Thank you so much, Kris. That was such a fabulous presentation and such beautiful photography.
It was fast.
Yeah, yes.
Quick trip.
And now we'll get to dig in a little bit more, so this will be perfect.
Good.
So before we go back to South America, I wanted to bring you back to California.
Yeah.
We mentioned that you're a fourth-generation Californian, so I'd love to have you just start from the beginning, telling us a little bit about how you grew up and kind of where your passion for the environment and conservation really springs from.
Well, as you said, I grew up on a ranch where my great-grandfather, he founded it, and my grandfather was born there, our father was born there, we were born there. So we were sort of hooligans, as ranching kids often are, and outside a lot. But I don't think that my sensibilities toward nature really started there. Maybe it made me more comfortable in it. Yeah. We moved to Venezuela when I was 8 years old for 3 years, and then came out of there. And that was probably the first time that I was exposed to so many species that, as a Californian, you'd never see. And they're right there. It was not in Caracas. We were way out in the Orinoco Basin. I don't know. I think Yvon had a huge impact on my life. I met him when I was 15. And once you get into the climbing tribe, I don't think it's like Hotel California. You never leave. And I would credit Yvon with a lot of what's happened in my life. Yeah. My family was more traditional, and the ladies wore pearls and not climbing ropes. But so I think that he had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear more about that. That's what I was going to ask you next. So it sounds like you guys met climbing, but would love to hear more about that, how you guys connected, and then ultimately what brought you to Patagonia, and how you ended up as the CEO there.
Well, I was supposed to go to a girls' boarding school, and I swore to my mother I wouldn't go. So I went to the local high school and then realized I don't know. Anyway, Yvon was renting the house next to our family's beach house, and there were a lot of climbers around quite a bit. I had an older brother who was sort of in with that crowd, and I was 15, artists, and in the absence of a pull toward my own age at the local high school, I started hanging out with them. And then after my first year in college, my mother informed me during the front end of summer that, contrary to my personal belief, she was not my personal banker. And that I needed to get a job. So I was worried. I didn't know how to do anything. And so Yvon said, why don't you come work for me? So I did. There were 6 people there, just technical rock and ice climbing equipment. And so we all wore bathing suits to work, and I would peel the labels off carabiners from Germany or package things. And then for every summer after that, it was a default. And then when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I was going to do. And our family is very strict. The minute that your degree touches the end of this finger, you're on your own. There's like a French guillotine coming down, which was fine. We understood that. But I had no idea what I was going to do. And so I just started working for Yvon full time. Something I've never regretted, obviously. It was all pretty organic. Yeah. I think it's very different now when you graduate from college. In your studies, you have a direction, you're going somewhere. And in our family, you just needed to go to college. Nobody really talked too much about what you needed to do after that or preparing for that. So. And then a year, I was 22. So when I was 23, Yvon decided, I'd like to make some clothing for climbers, for all of us. And that's how it got going, and that's how it is now.
Yeah. And then what did your trajectory there look like? How did you go from labels off carabiners to being the CEO?
Oh, it was so small, starting at 0. And you did everything. Yeah. Shipper, hand labeling our little tiny early catalogs out to whomever had requested one. And I like running things. I mean, I see that now. I don't think I knew it then, but I think I just naturally expanded what I was doing. And Yvon loves working with women. Yeah. He really, he's very, I won't say biased in that direction, but he's cognizant of that. Yeah. And a lot of trust in me, and also Melinda Chenard, his wife. So if I was given something to do, I would grab onto it, and I wouldn't, it's like a bone for a dog. I grabbed it and I didn't give it back. Maybe that's how. But I loved it, and I have a kind of endless pit for taking on stuff that's especially difficult, or things that I didn't know about heretofore.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I was particularly curious to ask you about, for me, I am such an admirer, and I'm sure many other people in the room, of Patagonia's commitment to sustainability, and how that seems like it's such a, excuse me, core value of the company, through the products, through a lot of the campaigns the company has funded. I'd love to hear you talk more about sort of that, how that ethos began, and how you guys really saw that as tied to the business, because it seems like it really always has been.
Oh, it's absolutely Yvon and Melinda Chenard. Absolutely. If you pull a string in anything that you would find inside the company today, that string will lead back to one of them, whether it's childcare and Melinda's insistence that we build that population into our planning, the understanding of the ecological crisis in the mid-'70s. Absolutely, they both were there. I mean, at a time when I had no idea. Yeah. Rose Marcario, the CEO of Patagonia, is absolutely imbued and very, very aggressive about the company taking a lead, whether it's sustainability or fighting for Bears Ears, public lands, you name it. The company is really on the front lines, and I think that's the value system that we've had since the beginning, but it's absolutely clear. I just came from a 2-day Patagonia board meeting, and it's full of these discussions about how do you keep pushing the line out, asking more of yourself, asking more of customers in terms of educating them, and will they join us as the lawsuit was placed against the government having to do with public lands and Bears Ears. And the response to those things has been extraordinary. So they still run the company as a means to build the greatest products, which has always been Yvon's desire, but also to use the company absolutely as a mechanism to change the world. And that has, if I close my eyes at a board meeting and I listen to Yvon speak, it could have been 45 years ago when we got to going together. He is very consistent. Yeah. And I think that's just an extraordinary and unusual set of circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a little bit in your introduction about how meeting Doug Tompkins had this big influence on you in the next phase in your career. But we'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, about how you guys connected and sort of what led you to make this transition into conservation.
I'll tell you part of the story.
All right.
I met Doug when I was 19. He was a climbing partner and very good friend of Yvon's, and he was a climbing partner of my former husband's as well. So the climbing community is it's kind of small. Certainly back then it was a lot smaller. And I knew him since I was 19 and knew him during the Esprit days. And then we sort of lost track of each other, and then I was down in southern Argentina with Yvon and a few other people eating dinner in this 3-dog town, and in walks Doug Tompkins. And that's where it started. So that would have been 1990, I think. Yeah. And then was like an algae bloom.
And were either of you already working in conservation, or was it just really an extension of?
So yeah, Doug was looking at the first piece of property.
Okay.
Second.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was on his way.
Yeah. And
in Argentina.
Yeah. And what made you decide at that moment that you wanted to make this shift from having impact in the business world through having impact through your new work?
Oh well, love had a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
You know. If everything's built on that kind of love, then we'd be in great shape.
Absolutely.
Timing.
Yeah.
I think timing in life is really 40% of what happens to you, good and bad. We sort of got together at a time when I really wanted to do something else. I had started working with Yvonne when I was so young, and I was 40 years old, and I began to panic that I would be there when I'm 50 and 60 and maybe even 70, which is where I'm headed now. And I didn't know what it would be, but I also thought that the company would benefit from new leadership. And so the timing was perfect, really. Yeah. That's how it happened.
Yeah. And obviously, you've already shared with us a little bit about the huge, impact that you guys have made through conservation in your work. I was curious to hear you just talk a little bit about what's your feeling about the status of land conservation in general today. How are we doing? What are we doing enough, quickly enough?
Well, the obvious answer, are we doing enough? Using the royal we.
Yeah, right, exactly. Collectively.
Collectively, no.
Yeah.
I think if you look at just the raw numbers of area protected or on its even in transition versus the conversion of the natural world to production, we're definitely on the losing team. Yeah. So I think that to use a terrible militaristic metaphor, there's an army out there of people who don't want to see the effects of climate change play all the way out. Yeah. There are millions of people out there who really still believe that development has to be in balance with conservation, however that takes place. And no, we're not moving fast enough. Yeah. It doesn't. We can look at these numbers that Tompkins Conservation may be involved in, but when you look at the tsunami that's coming in, then it feels quite small. Yeah. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit more about how you guys ended up choosing Latin America as your focus area for your work?
Really, it started with Doug. He was a ski racer, as I was, and he used to train in the off seasons in Chile and Argentina, as all the teams did in those days. And he had no money, so he would hitchhike around Chile and Argentina every season. And that's how he began to know the countries, and he really fell in love with them. Mm-hmm. And then in 1968, he talked Yvonne in 2 weeks to drive from San Francisco to the tip of South America, surfing, climbing, skiing off of volcanoes, and with the goal of climbing this emblematic peak called Fitzroy in southern Argentina. And they did, and they were gone 6 months, and they did everything they had planned to do. And when it was all over, they sold the van, they'd driven down, and came back to California. And it really set something in their minds about this place, which in 1968 was really kind of like a phantom, this romantic, wild place on Earth that nobody really knew anything about. And then Yvonne, 5 years later, decides he wants to start making clothes, and he settled on Patagonia as the name. So that's so when Doug started looking around to see where he would work, at least one of the areas, because at the same time we're doing all this, we're doing other things as well that aren't necessarily directed at the Southern Cone. But the conservation side, he just always had this affinity toward it since he got started. So that's really the nut of it.
Well, that makes sense. And of course, we talked about the incredible announcement in January of the 10 million acres. And you started to say a little bit about marine conservation as sort of a next frontier, but I'd love to hear you talk about where do you want to go from here? I know you've already achieved so much, but what's sort of on the horizon?
Well, I'm definitely interested in marine protected areas, and I don't really see us moving out of the Southern Cone. That's for one thing, because we're a small team, and I feel like it's really important that we build off of what we've done so far and not just go some new place and start from zero again, because there's still so many things that we could do in conjunction with the various governments in the two countries and building off of those relationships and so on. So the marine area, we have our big vision is going around Cape Horn. It is it's a convergence, a marine convergence between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. So that's where we're especially interested. These are just ideas. There are a lot of people working in the marine area down in Chile, not so much in Argentina. I think that it's important to talk with the leaders of the sovereign states and ask them, are there areas where we might be of service to the goals of the government and so on. And then, of course, there are always projects that on the terrestrial side and the agricultural side, although that takes place out of our family life and not inside the foundation. So I don't have any intention of doing anything else until I fly away. So I feel blessed to be doing what we're doing, especially blessed that we have the teams we have. That I know many times it's sort of the Doug and Kris show, but that isn't it at all. I mean, we have so many people who've been with us for so many years. And in Chile, these parks have been built, created by Chileans, and the same can be said for those in Argentina. So I always need to remind people that we wouldn't have gotten off first base without a tremendous amount of work and dedication on that side. And I think that as far as we've seen, we're all in to keep going.
That's so wonderful. So I know I really like the title that you gave your talk today of Paying Rent to the Earth. So I was so curious to hear you talk a little bit about what does that mean to you and how does that relate to the work that you do?
I don't know who coined that pay your rent for living on the planet. I don't know if it was Yvonne or Doug or both, or I'm not sure. But it's absolutely true. I think regardless of where you are in your life, you're working at Google, you're working at Patagonia, you're working for yourself, you're not working at all. It's impossible. One of the reasons we're stuck where we are is that we as humans have separated ourselves from the fact that we're dependent on the natural world. Yeah. So I think that the big challenge is how do you use every asset of your personal life toward changing that trend? Yeah. That's really the question.
Yeah.
And so when I say assets, I think where you work is an asset. What your personal strengths are your assets. How you use your spare time is an asset that you have. And I think paying your rent for living on the planet is it sounds superficial, but it's actually quite deep if you adopt it. That I will do something every day that has nothing to do with myself. And that's how I'm going to get out of bed every day. Yeah. And it's a slogan in a certain kind of way, but it's it's an important one because we have to live our lives with intention to the best that we can, and it's hard because we live in a culture that's going in the other direction. We're valued by our financial means. The values, the criteria by which we're measured don't really reinforce pay your rent for living on the planet. Yeah. So people have to discard or roll back the importance of some of the criteria that we've placed on ourselves and take an independent decision to live your life differently, or a little differently at least. Nobody's a saint here. We're all swimming in this sea of contradictions, that we face climate change and these other facts that are very clear to us, and yet we have tremendous technology at our touch. We have tremendous opportunities to move around and see parts of the world we wouldn't have otherwise. And somehow we have to find a real balance between those things, yeah. Or we're, as Jane says, we're stealing the future, yeah, from those who come after us, and the human and non-human world. So that's what it means.
Yeah, yeah. And you really just touched upon, the value of individual action. What advice do you give people who say, I don't know where to start, I want to have a positive impact, but I don't know where to begin? How do you advise people to get more engaged?
Well, I used to speak at a lot of business schools, and always the day would end like this: what would you do if you were us? And I always say the same thing. When I was your age, we didn't know what we know today. So I had it a lot easier than you guys have. The problem is, once you know what you know, then you can't turn your back on that. And so this is a really simplistic answer to your question, but I do believe that most of life is intention. Yeah. It is not difficult to decide what you personally will do. You have to decide that you're going to do something, or hopefully plural, some things. And then go out and find out what should you be doing. You can make donations to places, and they should be well thought through. Are these groups who are really active and willing to push the boundaries of what's taking place now? Or you can go out and chain yourself to a heavy equipment, I don't know, what do you call those things, and stop big trees from being plowed down in the Sierra. The point is to act. The point is to participate in a way that reflects your own values all the time, not all the time, but every day, something. Because that's the problem. I think we all get stuck on, what can I do? What should be my first step? The first step is just getting out of bed and saying, this is where I'm headed. And if I don't know who it is, or where it is, or what it is, I'm going to find out. I'm going to try to figure out what are the root causes of where we find ourselves, which most of us are really not clear on. And I would include myself in that category several years ago. If you don't understand how we got here, you can't really understand what it takes to mitigate those things that have been so horribly destructive in the last couple hundred years, or however you want to measure it. I study the collapse of civilizations as an avocation. Because I keep trying to understand, why would we do this over and over and over again when, as Jared Diamond would say, the pattern of civil collapse is so repetitive. So what is it about us that we can't move against those trends? Or do we just abdicate and say, well, this is human nature, we'll spiral up and out and then evolve again? But I say I don't think that's the way to go about it. You should try to fight against those things that are triggers for this, toward the destruction of the natural world and the greatest extinction crisis in history. Yeah. And especially when you start learning about the stakes of the marine systems, it's bloody desperate. So that's a choice. We have to make a choice. And it doesn't mean you run off and live in a cave, but it does mean that you have to take a stand somewhere along the trajectory of our daily lives.
Absolutely. I think that's wonderful advice. Well, I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm sure people in the audience are eager to ask Kris their questions. So we have a microphone here in the center aisle. So please feel free to come on up and share your questions.
Hi, Kris.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to Google. I know that there's a lot of inspiration around the idea of protecting half the Earth, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yes.
And also,
we just met with Dr. E.O. Wilson 10 days ago, who originated the concept of half Earth, and then there's nature needs half, and there are various versions of this. So we all get stuck in, well, okay, then half Earth, so which half, and how would that happen? So we immediately set up roadblocks because it would be insanely difficult to do that. However, I think what he's trying to say and move toward is this, that for healthy ecosystems, for human and non-human life, as a rough estimate, half of the Earth needs to be very well cared for. Maybe not completely without some production in it, but it has to be really managed, or systems begin to collapse as they are in the oceans and so on. So I think that it's a bold way to describe the necessity to move forward from where we are now to where we need to get to in 50 years, or what should we look like at the end of this century? I think for me, it's a better way to look at this. And when you have a circumstance where you have rising human population base, you have a rising consumption level, and you have a falling resource base. So somewhere, if you just do the math, you have this inherent conflict that we're speeding toward, and it has different manifestations, whether it's climate change or other big moves, the extinction crisis and so on. So I think that, yes, the conversation of half Earth needs to be on the table. How do you execute that, and how do you move just intellectually toward that is a challenge. It's not simple, but it's probably real. I think it's real. And I think that we, as these crises begin to mount, whether they're through climate change and other factors, society will move toward that by necessity. So it's not all going to be volunteer or voluntary, but it will be something like that. It's a lot to wrap your head around. It's a lot for me to wrap around my head. But my instincts tell me that our way of life, imagining there are no limits to growth, there are no limits to the things that we want and that we can do, is truly a fabrication of false hope. It's not true. I don't believe it. I don't think anybody who's really thought about the possibility of economic growth, infinite economic growth, is possible. And I know there are bazillions of conversations about this, and I don't pretend to have the final answer, but I do know that these are things that individuals, companies, everybody needs to be talking about instead of sitting on them as if there's some sort of deep secret that nobody wants to face. Then, as in all things, that will knock you off your chair.
Thanks for coming today. Congrats on 10 million acres. That's a big number. What do you consider the essential pieces of that really coming to reality? And if you had to counsel groups such as yourselves that were getting started in other places in the world, you know, things that come to mind are, how does the president balance all the influences on them, business development, growth, with preserving nature? What were the hard parts? How did you solve them, and how would you advise others in your shoes?
Well, first of all, which is the most nebulous, and I apologize for this, but there are moments when things like this at this scale can take place. And there are other moments when the stars aren't lined up and the circumstances are not there for you to do it. So that's a piece of it, and it's not a small piece. But as we see even in the United States now, leadership and how it looks at conservation, protected areas, whether they're parks or monuments, and the idea of public lands in general, varies from administration to administration. So it is a matter of picking your moment. And it is a matter of really tying the economics for the regions that these parks are located, that the economic development long-term is actually probably best suited to be tied to, in this case, a national park. That, as I said at the beginning, economic development as a consequence of conservation. And a really good way to look at this is if you see the country of Botswana. 15 years, 25 years ago, Botswana had a big kind of vision plan for their country, and it involved mining and all sorts of things. But then, starting with the Okavango, of course, they began to see that tourism was changing the story for many local economies, and it doesn't show any sign of shrinking. In fact, it's growing. So we were able to work with Chilean leadership in creating these parks as a master plan for economic development. It is not true. I don't know of any case where countries who have developed national parks have kicked the bejesus out of their ability to grow economically. It is a myth that excuse me, that's a Freudian slip, countries have to choose one way or the other. It's just not true. If I was leading a country, which I never will, you need to do both. If you're an inspired leader, you have the courage to insist on both. And this, I think, was the motivation for President Bachelet, because mark my words, anybody can have a great idea, but you will not achieve that great idea unless, especially at a large scale, unless you have true partnerships who will go the distance with you. And in this case, President Bachelet and her ministers were absolutely the reason that this happened. I mean, we couldn't have done it on our own because we don't make national parks. We don't designate them, I mean. So if somebody wants to start something, whether it's here, wherever it is, to your question, you have to decide what it is you're trying to save. You have to know that area like crazy. You need to map it. You need to think about it. You need to walk across it. You need to know who your neighbors are. You need to know if this would be an asset for the country overall. It's just like building any big project. You have to do a lot of groundwork first and then take your first step. But before that, you have to love these areas. Whatever it is, you better love them, and it better be a deep love, because these things are not simple. And you have to be willing to be unpopular sometimes and hold hopes and dreams for your land trust or whatever it is that will be challenged, and people will find you're an intrusion on the development of the economy, and so on. So you have to stay the course. That's another point of advice I'd give you.
Thank you.
But I hope you do it.
Well, I think we're going to need to leave it there. Kris, thank you so
Oh.
much again. This has been just tremendous.
Good. Thanks, you guys. And thank you, Google.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
use Google not on the hour, on the 5 minutes. So thank you very much for making our lives much easier. And I hope that Google, through its enormous expanse of contact in the world, takes Mother Earth along with it and does what it can with this unbelievable population of people whom you have. And charge yourselves and the company with seeing that 100 years from now we have healthy ecosystems and healthy, dignified human populations. Thank you.